I want you to close your eyes and imagine that you have just won the lottery and you can now buy just about anything that you want, and somehow all your financial problems have vanished. That would be fantastic, right? Well, research suggests that it will probably not be as great as you imagined. And if you wondered why you were so wrong about how you would feel after you have met the love of your life, or how you would ever make it through an unfortunate situation, well, this book, Stumbling on Happiness by Dr. Daniel Gilbert, will quench your curiosity. In the book, Dr. Daniel makes a serious argument about why you and I are always making wrong predictions about what will make us happy, and also provides insights into the weaknesses and eccentricities of human imagination. So in this video, I'll be reviewing this book. I'll be talking about the shortcomings of our imagination, the solution to the shortcomings, and why, unfortunately, we tend to reject the solution. So if this is something that you're interested in, please stay tuned and let's delve right in. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Cynthia, and on this channel I talk about metaphysics, psychology, and everything in between. As mentioned earlier, today I'm going to be doing a book review on Stumbling on Happiness, a book by Dr. Daniel Gilbert. Dr. Daniel in his book says that one of the greatest achievements of the human being is our ability to imagine objects and episodes that do not exist in the realm of the real, which means that we have the ability to imagine the future and how it will be. However, as it states in his book, our imagination is very flawed and fallible. So that is where I want to start. I want to start this review by talking about the shortcomings of our imagination. And shortcoming number one is the filling in trick. If I asked you to imagine a plate of spaghetti and then tell me how much you would enjoy eating it for dinner tomorrow, two things are going to happen. One, you're going to come up with a mental image of you eating spaghetti effortlessly because your brain does the heavy construction work of imagining. And second, notice how your spaghetti, the spaghetti that you've imagined, is much richer than the one I've asked you to imagine. You have not even asked about the nuances of eating this spaghetti. I mean, are you eating it in your kitchen by the kitchen counter, or are you at a restaurant? But somehow your imagination just came up with this picture of you eating spaghetti. Your brain behaved like a portrait artist and painted a picture of you eating spaghetti. When you estimate your enjoyment for this future spaghetti, you respond to this particular mental image as you would respond to a particular memory or perception, as though the detail had been specified by the thing you are imagining rather than fabricated by your brain. In so doing, you make an error that your future spaghetti self may regret. Trying to predict how much you will enjoy the plate of spaghetti without knowing which type of spaghetti is kind of like trying to predict how much you'll pay for a car without knowing which type of car it is. Is it a Ferrari? Is it a Chevy? Or it's also kind of like how you predict how you feel about an achievement of your spouse. Is it that the achievement is they won a Nobel Prize, or did they get the best divorce lawyer in town? So research shows that when people make predictions about how they will react to future events, they neglect the fact that their brains will perform this filling in trick as an integral part of the act of imagining. So here's another example from this book that will help you understand this filling in trick further. So imagine your spouse, your partner, whatever, tells you to, escort them to a party next Friday evening. So suddenly your imagination will manufacture this picture of let's say a party downtown in the penthouse of some hotel, right? And then there's these waiters in black tie that are carrying food on silver plates, with a slightly bored harpist playing in the background. And then you'll say, I'll pass. You are saying you'll pass without knowing exactly what kind of party, but because your brain has manufactured this picture of a party in your mind that you think you'll hate, so you say, no, I'll pass. But there are so many kinds of parties, right? There are birthday celebrations, there are gallery openings, there are office parties, but you did not consider all that. So imagine that your spouse just, drags you along anyway. And then, guess what? It was exactly your kind of party and you had a marvelous time. It was cheap beer, hula hoops, your kind of style. And so you were wrong about your prediction about disliking the experience, the party, because of this mental image that your brain, created and filled in the different aspects of the party that you thought it was. The funny thing is that even if you now know that your brain does this feeling in trick, you will not help but expect that the future will unfold with the details you imagine. And I don't blame you, because if our brain didn't do this feeling in trick, we'll be walking around with an empty imagination and a small dark hole following us wherever we went. The second shortcoming of our imagination is the living out trick. The greatest impediments and aberration of the human understanding is the fact that the things that strike our senses outweigh those things, even if more important, do not strike our senses directly. What I'm trying to say is that our inattention to absences influence how we think of the future. So, for example, I want you to imagine that you are seated in your dream car and you're driving around, right? I want you to imagine the curve of the grille, the slant of the windshield, the smell of that new interior of a car. I want you to imagine that scenario. So, no matter how long you spend doing that, in that imagination, if I asked you, okay, so I want you to go back to that mental image that you've created and I want you to read me the number plate, you will agree that while you're imagining, you obviously left out some aspects, right? And that is insane. How our imagination, when we are imagining a future event or how we'll feel, like we leave out details, which details are actually very important, which will influence how we shall actually feel about that future event. Here's another example that will help you understand this living out trick further. So I want you to imagine that after 5 years, you lose your spouse to an accident. Yes, I know this is a very gruesome imagery, but I just want you to imagine that. So you probably think, of course I'll be devastated. I'll probably not be able to even get up from bed in the mornings, right? It's hard to find someone who would say that in addition to these heartbreaking, morbid images, they also imagine the other things that would inevitably happen in the 2 years following their spouse's death. For example, eating a toffee apple on a warm evening, reading a book, riding a bicycle, going on a first date, or any of the many activities that you would expect to happen in those 2 years. The point here is that the 2-year period following a tragic event has to contain something. That is, it has to contain some kind of episode or occurrence of some kind. And these episodes and occurrences have some emotional consequences, regardless of whether they are large or small, positive or negative, that impact you in some kind of way. And yet you can't imagine anything other than the awful event. So this reminds me of a show that I watched in the past and I absolutely loved. It's called Dead to Me. I'm going to put it here. So I don't know if you have watched Dead to Me, but in Dead to Me, the protagonist, the main character, loses her husband. And when she loses her husband, she thinks, she will never get out of that slump. But a whole occurrence of episodes take place. She actually meets the woman. So her husband died in an accident, right? A hit and run. And it so happened that she ended up meeting the woman that, knocked the husband and ran away. And of course, this woman was hiding from all that had happened. And then they kind of cultivated a friendship. And of course, a whole series of events took place. But to cut the long story short, so they end up being friends. And even when she finds out that, she's the one who was responsible for the death of her husband, already some things that happened there in the middle, the protagonist actually met her new lover through that woman, and she even ended up giving birth, to a daughter. And then, even though they had built this very strong friendship with the woman that had knocked her husband, that woman died, and she died of cancer in the end. And this protagonist felt so bad. But when at the end of the show, one would think that, oh my God, it was so terrible that she lost her husband. Of course, it's always terrible when you have, when you go through a tragic situation. But what I'm trying to say here is that in this living out trick, in that moment when you're feeling all these things, you think that you will never be able to breathe again, you'll never be able to get out of bed in the morning, you'll never be able to move on with your life. And yet, guess what? Your imagination is living out so many things, so many episodes, so many occurrences that are obviously going to happen and are obviously going to have such a strong emotional influence on how you feel. You see, when you imagine your future, you leave out a whole lot of detail. And this detail matters a great bit, because what you fail to consider could have a serious impact on the conclusions that you draw about how you feel about these future events. So any brain that does the feeling in trick is bound to do the living out trick as well. And that means that the future you imagine is containing details that your brain invented and is lacking the details that your brain ignored. And the problem isn't that our brains, do this living out, this feeling in and living out trick. The problem is that they do it so well that we aren't aware that it is happening. And if our brains can be so liberal, when we're imagining, that means they can also be conservative. And that is another shortcoming with this own story. Let's get into shortcoming number 3. Shortcoming number 3, the reality first policy. So, I've been talking about, of course, from the book, that our brains do this feeling in trick. So when you think about feeling in, it's kind of like there's a hole in our imagination that the brain is trying to fill in, right? So, of course, if it's like a hole, for example, a hole in a wall or a hole in your tooth, it has to be filled in with some sort of material. So the material that our brains use to fill in those gaps when we're imagining about future events is today. So your brain uses the events of today and how you feel to fill in those gaps when it's imagining the future. And that is wild. Okay, let's get into it. Have you noticed that you close your eyes when you're trying to visualize an object and you jam your fingers in your ears when you're trying to memorize a certain melody? Well, it is because your brain uses its visual and auditory cortices to be able to imagine that thing that you're trying to visualize and remember, that melody that you're trying to remember. But if these parts, if your visual and auditory cortices are busy doing their primary job, that is, they're hearing, they're seeing the things in real life, the things that are happening in real life, then they're not available for imagination. That's why it is very hard to imagine a penguin when you are busy inspecting an ostrich, because your imagination requires the visual and auditory cortices. Put differently, when you ask your brain to look at a real object and an imaginary object, it will always look at the real object first because of the reality first policy that it follows. The policy that makes it difficult for you to imagine a penguin when you're looking at an ostrich makes it difficult for you to imagine wealth when you're experiencing poverty, and to imagine affection when you're experiencing anger, and also to imagine hunger when you are feeling full. So the brain cannot see and feel two things at the same time, and it has strict priorities about what it will feel, hear, and see, and what it will ignore. Here is the kicker. Both the sensory and emotional systems enforce this policy, and yet you seem to recognize when the sensory system has turned down imagination's request, but failed to recognize when the emotional system does the same thing. For example, in a study, researchers telephoned different people in different parts of a country and asked them about how satisfied they were with their lives. People who lived in cities that happened to be having nice weather that day imagined their lives, they reported that their lives were relatively happy. But when people who lived in cities that happened to be having bad weather that day imagined their lives, they reported that their lives were relatively unhappy. These people try to answer the researchers' question by imagining their lives and then asking themselves how they felt when they did so. Their brains enforced the reality first policy and insisted on reacting to real weather instead of imaginary lives. But apparently, these people did not know that their brains were doing this, and thus they mistook reality-induced feelings for imaginary-induced pre-feelings. Indeed, one of the hallmarks of depression is that when depressed people are asked to imagine future events, they cannot imagine liking them very much. A vacation, a romance, a night out on the town, no thanks, I'll sit here in the dark. Isn't that tragic? This is the thing. You cannot feel good about an imaginary future when you are busy feeling bad about an actual present. And we find that we fail to recognize that this is the brain's inevitable result of the reality first policy. Imagination shortcoming number 4 is rationalization. When people are asked to predict how they will feel if they lose a job or a romantic partner, if their candidate loses an important election, fail an interview or flunk an exam, they consistently overestimate how awful they'll feel and how long they'll feel awful. The fact is, negative events do affect us, but they generally don't affect us as much or for as long as we expect them to. Here is something to ponder. Able-bodied people are willing to pay far more to avoid being disabled than disabled people are willing to pay to become able-bodied again. This is because able-bodied people underestimate how happy disabled people are. So if negative events don't hit us as hard as we expect them to, then why do we expect them to? Well, let me explain. The human mind tends to exploit ambiguity. Objective stimuli in the world create subjective stimuli in the mind, and it's this subjective stimuli to which people react. And one of the many things that distinguish us from rats and pigeons is that we respond to the meanings of such stimuli and not the stimuli themselves. So rather than thinking you are pangolosian, which is just a fancy word for extreme optimism, think of yourself as having a psychological immune system that defends your mind against unhappiness in much the same way that your physical immune system defends your body against illnesses. Your physical immune system must balance between two competing needs, right? It must recognize and defend you against foreign invaders such as viruses and bacteria. And then it must recognize and respect your body's own cells. That means that if it's hypoactive, it will fail to protect you against micro predators, and then you of course get infections. But if it's hyperactive, it will protect you against your own body's cells, right? And then you will start getting autoimmune diseases. So just how the physical immune system works is the same way psychological immune system works. It also has to balance between two competing needs. One, it must defend you, but it mustn't defend you too well. What I mean is this: when you face the pain of rejection, loss, misfortune, and failure, the psychological immune system must not defend you too well. You mustn't think that I'm perfect and everyone is against me. But it must not fail to defend you, where you find yourself having thoughts like, I'm a loser and I ought to be dead. A healthy psychological immune system has to strike a balance that allows you to feel good enough to cope with your situation, but bad enough to do something about it. But here is something you need to know about your psychological immune system. Your psychological immune system is only activated when you feel sufficiently unhappy. For example, say you lose your job. Your psychological defenses is going to, come in, and you'll start having thoughts of, you know what, I probably didn't need this job, and maybe this is an opportunity for me to follow my actual calling as a sculptor. So that means that stabbed toes or, the slightest tingle of sadness, anger, jealousy, these things do not activate your psychological immune system. Your psychological immune system is activated when there is a huge assault on your happiness. The paradoxical consequence of this is that it's sometimes very difficult to achieve a positive view of a bad experience than a very, very bad experience. And that is why you might ultimately feel better when you are a victim of an insult rather than being a bystander to it. So here is something about psychological immune system and psychological defenses that I found to be very intriguing in this book. Apparently, the brain and the eye have a contractual relationship where the brain has accepted to believe whatever the eye sees, as long as the eye sees what the brain wants it to see. So the two are conspirators, and just like any conspiracies, theirs is negotiated behind closed doors, behind in some back dark room that is far from your awareness. So because you do not realize that you have generated a positive view of your current experience, you do not realize that you will do it again in the future. Not only does this naivety cause you to overestimate the intensity and duration of your distress in the face of future adversity, but it also leads you to take action that may undermine this conspiracy. So now let's talk about the solution to these shortcomings of our imagination, which is surrogation. One of the benefits of being a social and linguistic animal is that you can capitalize on the experiences of other people rather than having to figure out everything yourself. Communication is like a vicarious observation that allows us to, to kind of discover how we shall feel about certain situations or certain decisions that we make in the future in the comfort of our own homes. You just pick up a phone, send an email, and inquire about, how a person who's experiencing that situation is taking it, how their feelings, their thoughts, what they're going through, so you can kind of paint a clear picture of your emotional response to that future event as well. So you do not have to imagine how you will feel when you marry a lawyer, move to a different country, because there's so many other people who have done that and they are all too happy to share their experiences. So this is a cheap way and an easy and quick way that will give you a strikingly accurate prediction of your future feelings about that future event. Since imagination fails us, perhaps we should give up on imagining entirely and use other people as surrogates for our future selves. Now, I can suspect that you're having objections to this type of thinking. You're probably thinking, I cannot use other people's experiences as proxies of my own because we are all different, right? And you're probably thinking that, I might as well just base off my predictions on my somewhat fickle imagination rather than basing it on reports of people whose tastes and preferences and emotional proclivities are radically different from my own. But research shows that when people are deprived of information that imagination requires, they are forced to use others as surrogates, and when they do, they make remarkably accurate predictions about their future feelings. As you're about to find out, we often reject this simple solution, and here's why. Why we reject surrogation. If you're like most people, then like most people, you do not know that you're like most people. Science has provided so many facts about the average person, but the most reliable fact is that most average people do not know that they are average people. For example, most students believe that they are more intelligent than the average student. Most managers believe that they are more competent than the average manager. And most football players think that they have a better football sense than their teammates. This tendency to think of ourselves as better than most people is not a manifestation of unfettered narcissism, rather than just the belief that we are unique from others. So what makes us feel so darn special? Well, three things. One, even if we're not special, the way we know ourselves is. We are the only people in the world whom we know from the inside and out. We are very well aware of our own thoughts and feelings, but must infer that other people are experiencing theirs, right? The second reason is that we like to think of ourselves as special. We like to fit in well with our peers, but not too well. We prize our unique identities, and research shows that when people are made to feel too similar to others, their moods quickly sour, and then they try to distinguish themselves from those people in a variety of different ways. For example, if you attended a party where you found someone wearing the same exact attire as you, so you know how unsettling it is to share a room with an unwanted twin whose presence temporarily dismisses or diminishes your sense of individuality. The third reason why we tend to overestimate our uniqueness is because we overestimate other people's uniqueness. What I mean is that we tend to think of people as more different from one another than they are. Individual similarities are vast and we don't care much about them because they don't help us to do what we came here on earth to do, namely distinguishing Jack from Jill and Jill from Jennifer. As such, these individual similarities are an inconspicuous backdrop against which a small number of relatively minor individual differences stand out in bold relief. Because we spend so much time searching for, attending to, thinking about, and remembering these differences, we tend to overestimate their magnitude and frequency, and thus end up thinking of people as more varied than they actually are. So, our belief in the variedness of others and uniqueness of self is especially powerful when it comes to emotions, because we feel our emotions but must infer the emotions of others by watching their faces and listening to their voices. We have an impression that they probably don't feel emotions as intensely as we do, and that is why we want them to recognize our feelings even if we can't recognize their feelings. Our mythical belief in the variability and uniqueness of individuals is the main reason why we reject others as surrogates. After all, surrogation is only useful when we can count on our surrogates to react to a future event roughly in the same manner that we would. But if we believe that people's emotional reactions are varied, then surrogation will seem not useful to us than it actually is. So, in conclusion to this video, nature has given us an incredible gift that no other life form has, and that is the ability to project ourselves into the future and experience events before they happen, which allows us to learn from mistakes before they happen and evaluate actions before taking them. But as we have seen in this book, our imaginations are flawed and fallible. When we imagine our futures, we think of events, we fill in situations, events that will probably not happen, and leave out the events or the details that may actually happen. And then we fail to understand that once something happens, we'll feel differently about it. Okay, these are all things that I've talked about in this book. This book has given us a solution to our imagination shortcomings, which is surrogation. But because we think we are unique and we think we are very different from other people, like we have seen, we tend not to take on surrogation as a solution to the shortcomings of our imagination. But as we have seen, we have a lot of similarities. So when you're thinking about a big decision in your life, say you want to move to a different country, you want to know how it is to get married to a lawyer, really anything that you are contemplating, find someone who is actually going through that same thing and ask them how they feel. Because that information, when you use that information that they give you to predict your future, you will make a remarkably accurate prediction about how you feel in the future. So I really liked this book. When I first picked up this book, I was in my mind, I was thinking I'm going to learn about, how to, be happy in my life, to generate more happiness. And my goodness, I was pleasantly surprised because this book, first of all, it has so many research studies about all these different things that I've talked about. It is really eye-opening, and I'm just going to go ahead and read what some of these renowned authors wrote about this book. For example, Malcolm Gladwell said, if you have even the slightest curiosity about the human condition, you ought to read it, trust me. And then the New York Times, okay, a lucid, charmingly written argument for why our expectations don't pan out. I recommend this book. It is very insightful, very eye-opening, and it was really witty and enjoyable. I honestly love this book. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and let me know what you thought about my review of this book in the comments section below. I am very interested to know. And please remember to subscribe to my channel, as that will help me out a lot. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye.